They were starving. They had 10 pistols between them. Against them, 20,000 Nazi soldiers with tanks, flamethrowers, and orders to kill every last one. The Germans expected it to take 3 days. It took 27. This is the story of 1,800 Jews who refused to die quietly. The date was April 1943, Passover morning, the Jewish Festival of Freedom. SS General Jürgen Stroop led his forces into the Warsaw Ghetto, expecting another routine roundup for the death camps. His troops marched confidently into the sealed district where the remaining Jews were trapped. They'd done this dozens of times across occupied Europe. The pattern was always the same. Soldiers arrive, Jews comply, trains depart, a machine of murder running with terrifying efficiency. But this morning, something broke the pattern. At the corner of Naluki and Gessia streets, as the first columns of troops entered the square, a Molotov cocktail arced through the air. It crashed at their feet in a burst of flame. Then gunfire erupted from windows, from rooftops, from doorways. German soldiers dove for cover. Some didn't make it. The Jews were shooting back. For the first time since the war began, Jews were making Germans run. And what makes this truly impossible is that these fighters weren't soldiers. They were teenagers. Starving teenagers with homemade bombs facing the army that conquered all of Europe. And for one glorious morning, they won. The Germans were stunned. This wasn't supposed to happen. Jews don't fight. They'd been conditioned through years of terror and starvation to obey, to comply, to march where they're told. But on this morning, nearly 1,800 Jewish fighters, most of them teenagers and young adults, had decided they would not go quietly into the gas chambers. Their weapons were pitiful. A few pistols smuggled from the outside. Homemade grenades packed with explosives stolen from German work sites. Molotov cocktails made from bottles and gasoline. Against them stood 20,000 troops with rifles, machine guns, tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers. The defenders were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. They were starving, exhausted, and had almost no ammunition. But for the first few hours, none of that mattered. The Germans advanced, and the Jews hit them from every direction. A squad of SS men moved down a street and was caught in crossfire from upper windows. They retreated. Another unit tried to flank through an alley and was driven back by grenades. A tank rumbled forward, confident and unstoppable, until a Molotov cocktail turned it into a torch. The crew bailed out, running for their lives. By noon, the impossible had happened. The German forces, the conquerors of Europe, had been forced to withdraw from the ghetto. General Stroop was beside himself with rage. His elite troops had been beaten back by a ragtag group of starving Jews with makeshift weapons. The psychological impact was devastating. Inside the ghetto, the fighters could barely believe what they'd accomplished. Young men and women, most barely out of their teens, had driven back the Nazi war machine. They knew this victory wouldn't last. They knew reinforcements would come. They knew how this ends. But for one day they were free. They were fighters. They were refusing to die on their knees. The German soldiers regrouped outside the walls, reorganizing for a second assault. But the confidence was gone. They were no longer facing victims. They were facing an enemy, and that changed everything. But to understand why they fought, you first have to understand what they were fighting against. The Warsaw Ghetto was a 1.3 square mile death trap where 500,000 people were marked for extermination. In November 1940, the Nazis sealed off a section of Warsaw and forced the city's Jewish population inside. 30% of Warsaw's people crammed into 2.4% of the city. Imagine 380,000 people packed into a space the size of Central Park, surrounded by walls 10 feet high, topped with barbed wire and broken glass. The conditions were hell. 7 to 8 people lived in single rooms. The official food ration was 184 calories per day, less than a single bagel. 6,000 to 7,000 people died every month from starvation and disease. Bodies were collected each morning like trash. Children begged for scraps. Mothers watched their babies waste away. Death became so common it lost its power to shock. But the ghetto was never meant to be permanent. It was a holding pen. In summer 1942, the SS began the Great Deportation. Every day, thousands of Jews were rounded up and loaded onto cattle cars. The Nazis claimed they were being resettled to work camps in the east. They were lying. Over 2 months, between 265 and 300,000 people were taken from Warsaw. They were sent to Treblinka, an extermination camp 60 miles away. Within hours of arrival, almost all were dead, murdered in gas chambers and burned in pits. At first, people believed the lie because the alternative was too horrible to accept. But the truth leaked back. Railroad workers saw what happened. Resistance fighters sent word. A few survivors escaped with testimony that couldn't be denied. The Nazis were murdering everyone. Every person who got on those trains was walking into a gas chamber. The compliance, the desperate hope that obedience might save you, it had all been for nothing. Adam Cherniakow, head of the Jewish Council, realized he'd been helping the Germans kill his own people. Rather than sign another deportation order, he took cyanide, leaving a note that read, "They are demanding that I kill the children with my own hands. There is nothing for me to do but die." By September, the ghetto's population had collapsed from nearly 500,000 to about 60,000. Those who remained knew this was temporary. Eventually, the Germans would come for them too. That knowledge changed everything. If death was certain, if compliance meant only a slower march to the gas chambers, then why not fight? Why not die with a weapon in your hand instead of in a cattle car? Out of that terrible realization, resistance was born. If you've been inspired by this story of courage against impossible odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you the most incredible battles and moments from history that deserve to be remembered. And drop a comment below telling us what historical event you'd like to see covered next. Your support keeps these stories alive. One man refused to let his people go quietly. Mordecai Anielewicz was 24 years old, a schoolteacher and youth organizer. He had no military training, no army, and almost no weapons. But he had something more dangerous than guns. He had a plan to fight back. Before the war, Anielewicz had been a leader in a Zionist youth movement. He was charismatic, intelligent, and absolutely committed to Jewish survival. When the deportations began, he was outside the ghetto trying to establish resistance networks. When he heard what was happening in Warsaw, he rushed back, sneaking through the sewers to get inside the sealed ghetto. What he found there hardened his resolve. If they were going to die, they would die fighting. Anielewicz became the commander of the Jewish Combat Organization. This was something unprecedented, an underground army forming inside a Nazi death trap. The organization brought together members from across the political spectrum. Socialists, communists, Zionists, groups that had spent years arguing with each other, now unified by a single goal, resistance. But wanting to fight and being able to fight were two different things. They had almost no weapons. At the start, the entire resistance had maybe 10 pistols. 10 against the German army. They needed guns, ammunition, explosives. They needed everything, and they had nothing. So they improvised with desperate creativity. They smuggled weapons from the other side of Warsaw, paying exorbitant prices to Polish smugglers for guns that barely worked. They stole from German work sites, pocketing explosives and detonators one piece at a time. They built makeshift grenades in secret workshops, packing tin cans with stolen dynamite. They melted down scrap metal to cast bullets. Every weapon was precious because every weapon was rare. Some fighters trained for weeks and never received a gun. They prepared to fight with whatever they could find: knives, clubs, bare hands if necessary. The Polish resistance provided some help. Not much, but some. A few dozen pistols, some grenades, instructions on making Molotov cocktails. It was nowhere near enough to fight a real battle, but it was something, and something was better than nothing. The fighters learned to maximize every bullet, every bomb. They practiced aiming until they could hit targets in the dark. They learned to throw grenades from rooftops, to time the fuse perfectly so it would explode on impact. While they gathered weapons, they prepared the battlefield. The fighters turned the ghetto into a fortress, transforming the architecture of oppression into a weapon against their oppressors. They connected attics so they could move between buildings without going into the street. They knocked holes through walls to create escape routes and firing positions. They built bunkers underground, elaborate hideouts connected by tunnels where fighters could rest and civilians could hide. Some of these bunkers were engineering marvels, carved out beneath ruined buildings, with electricity, running water, and enough supplies to last for weeks. The tunnels became an underground city, a secret world beneath the Nazis' feet. Anielewicz organized his fighters into 22 combat groups, each responsible for defending a specific area. He drilled them on urban warfare tactics, how to ambush from rooftops, how to use Molotov cocktails against tanks, how to retreat through the buildings and strike again from a different position, how to make every bullet count when you only had a handful of bullets to your name. None of them were soldiers, but they learned fast because they had to. Young women learned to throw grenades with deadly accuracy. Teenagers became expert snipers. Everyone learned to move through the attics and tunnels like ghosts. There was a second resistance group in the Ghetto, the Jewish Military Union. They were smaller, better armed, and more conservative politically. The two groups didn't always cooperate smoothly, but they shared the same goal: make the Nazis bleed. Make them pay for every inch of ground. Make them remember that Jews fought back. As winter turned to spring in 1943, the fighters knew time was running out. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler had ordered the complete liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. Every remaining Jew was to be sent to the camps. The fighters could have fled. Some did, escaping through the sewers to safety, but most stayed. They made a choice that defined their lives and their deaths. They would not go to Treblinka. They would fight. And if they died, they would die as free people, not as victims. On the morning of April 19th, as German soldiers marched in expecting an easy day, they had no idea they were walking into a trap that would become Nazi Germany's worst nightmare. For 72 hours, the uprising that was supposed to end in a morning continued. The Nazi war machine was being humiliated by teenagers with pistols, and General Stroop was furious. If he couldn't crush this quickly, the entire Reich would look weak. German units advanced into the ghetto and were torn apart by ambushes. Snipers fired from rooftops. Grenades rolled down stairwells. Molotov cocktails turned armored vehicles into death traps. The defenders used every advantage of urban warfare. They knew the terrain. They controlled the buildings. They struck hard and vanished before the Germans could respond. At Muranovsky Square, resistance fighters launched a coordinated assault that drove back an entire German battalion. In a moment of pure defiance, they raised two flags above the captured buildings: the Polish flag and a blue and white banner representing Jewish resistance. For 3 days, those flags flew over the ghetto, visible from across Warsaw, a symbol that the Jews were still fighting, a symbol that resistance was possible. Stroop escalated with overwhelming force. He brought in tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers. His forces swept through the ghetto building by building, but the defenders refused to break. They'd retreat from one position and strike from another. They'd let German troops pass, then attack from behind. They'd appear on a rooftop, fire a few shots, and disappear into the attics before the Germans could return fire. It was guerrilla warfare in the heart of occupied Europe, and against all odds, it was working. The Germans were taking casualties. Stroop's official reports admitted to losing 16 men in the first week, but the real number was almost certainly higher. Some estimates put German casualties in the hundreds. Every German soldier killed, every tank disabled, every retreat was a victory the defenders never thought possible. The psychological impact rippled beyond Warsaw. If Jews could resist in Warsaw, they could resist anywhere. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear this story. These moments of resistance against tyranny deserve to be known, remembered, and passed on. Hit that share button and spread the word. But the Germans had one advantage the Jews couldn't overcome: fire. On April 23rd, Stroop changed tactics completely. If he couldn't dig the fighters out, he'd burn them out. His troops began systematically setting the ghetto ablaze. Building by building, block by block, they turned the entire district into an inferno. Flamethrowers scorched apartments. Artillery shells packed with incendiaries crashed through roofs. The sky turned black with smoke that could be seen for miles. The heat was unbearable. Fires raged for days, consuming everything. The temperature in some streets reached levels that melted metal. Civilians hiding in attics were burned alive or suffocated by smoke. Fighters were forced out of their positions by flames, their carefully prepared defenses reduced to ash. The ghetto became a vision of hell, a landscape of destruction where the living stumbled through streets lined with charred corpses and collapsed buildings. The smell of burning wood, burning flesh, burning lives filled the air. Still, impossibly, the resistance continued. As the Germans torched the surface, the fighters retreated underground into their bunker system. 30,000 civilians hid in these underground warrens, and the fighters protected them with everything they had left. They launched raids from the tunnels at night, attacking German patrols, stealing weapons from dead soldiers, then disappearing back into the earth like vengeful spirits. The battle turned into a hunt. German troops searched for bunkers, listening for sounds underground, following survivors who cracked under pressure. When they found a bunker entrance, they'd pump in poison gas, smoke, or water, forcing the Jews out into the open where they could be shot or captured. It was methodical, brutal, and terrifyingly effective, but it took time, precious time. Days turned into weeks, and the ghetto still hadn't fallen. The uprising that was supposed to last hours was entering its second week, then its third. Every day the resistance held was a propaganda disaster for the Nazis and a beacon of hope for the rest of occupied Europe. In Berlin, officials raged at the delays. How could the mighty Wehrmacht be held up by starving Jews? Inside the bunkers, conditions were horrific beyond description. No food, no water, the air thick with smoke and the stench of death. People suffocating in the darkness, pressed together in spaces meant for a fraction of their numbers. Children crying. The wounded dying without medicine. But they didn't surrender. Fighters organized raids at night, striking at German positions and fading back into the ruins like ghosts. Women fought alongside men with equal ferocity. Teenagers no older than 15 or 16 threw grenades at tanks, knowing they likely wouldn't survive the day. Everyone who could hold a weapon fought. Those who couldn't became runners, messengers, medics. Everyone contributed to the resistance in whatever way they could. By early May, the ghetto was nothing but smoke and ruins. Fires rose from 1,000 points as the Nazis systematically torched every building, every bunker, every possible hiding place. The fighters knew the end was coming. Their ammunition was almost gone. Their numbers were dwindling, but they weren't done yet. Not while they could still pull a trigger, not while they could still throw one more grenade. The Germans knew the resistance was coordinated, which meant there had to be a command center somewhere. They intensified their search, interrogating prisoners, following every lead. On May 8th, they found it. The bunker at Mila 18, hidden beneath the ruins of a destroyed building, was the nerve center of the entire resistance. It was deeper than most bunkers, better concealed, better fortified. Mordecai Anielewicz and the leadership were inside, along with dozens of fighters and civilians who had taken refuge there. The Germans surrounded the bunker and called for surrender through loudspeakers. The answer was gunfire. The defenders knew what surrender meant: torture, interrogation, public execution. They chose to fight to the last bullet. So the SS brought up their gas equipment and began pumping poison into the bunker's air shafts. The Jews inside had a choice: suffocate in the darkness, come out to be captured for torture, or take control of their own deaths. Most chose the third option. They took their own lives rather than give the Nazis the satisfaction of their capture. Mordecai Anielewicz died in that bunker. He was 24 years old. He'd led the most significant Jewish armed resistance of the Second World War. He'd turned victims into fighters and inspired uprisings across occupied Europe. He'd proven that resistance was possible even when victory wasn't. And he chose to die on his own terms, with his comrades beside him, rather than in a German torture chamber or gas chamber. Before he died, he'd written a letter that was smuggled out of the ghetto. In it, he said, "My life's dream has come true. I have lived to see Jewish resistance in the ghetto in all its greatness and glory. Even with Anielewicz dead and the command structure shattered, the fighting continued. Scattered groups of fighters held out in the ruins, launching attacks from the rubble. Some escaped through the sewers to continue the fight elsewhere. Marek Edelman, one of the commanders, led survivors through miles of underground tunnels to safety. He would later become one of the most important witnesses to the uprising, ensuring the story would never be forgotten. On May 16, 1943, General Stroop sent his final report to Berlin. The Jewish quarter of Warsaw is no more. To mark the occasion, he ordered the Great Synagogue blown up. The explosion was meant to symbolize the final destruction of Jewish Warsaw. 27 days. That's how long the Warsaw Ghetto uprising lasted. The Germans expected 3. For nearly a month, 1,800 poorly armed Jews held off 20,000 German troops. They fought with courage that defied comprehension. They chose dignity over submission. They chose resistance over despair. The uprising inspired resistance movements across Nazi-occupied Europe. In other ghettos, Jews took up arms, knowing they would lose but fighting anyway. The message was clear. We will not go quietly. You will have to kill us, but we will make you pay. The survivors who escaped became witnesses. They carried the story out of the ashes and made sure the world would know that the Jews of Warsaw had not been passive victims, that they had fought back, that they had been heroes. Anielewicz wrote that his life's dream had come true. He had seen Jewish self-defense become a fact. He had proven that his people could stand and fight. And in doing so, he posed a question that echoes through history. When faced with certain death, would you go quietly or would you fight? The fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto answered that question with their lives. They chose to fight. And in fighting, they won something the Nazis could never take from them: their humanity, their freedom, their story. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and make sure you've got notifications turned on so you never miss the incredible true stories that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments what other moments from history you think deserve to be told. These stories matter. Your engagement helps us keep telling them. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about the courage that lives on in all of us.